Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I'm really pleased to introduce the final panel of day one of Emerge Americas 18. This is really going to be a powerhouse panel, as I mentioned a couple moments ago. We've got several keynote speakers that are experts in the field. So the focus of this next topic is on cybercrime, cyber warfare, and increased security threats. Really thinking about how we can protect our nation and internationally from emerging risks. So the speakers we have today are Greg Touhill, who is the president of Cyxtera Federal Group at Cyxtera Technologies, Tadeo, the Chief Information Security Officer at Cyxtera Technologies, and also Bill Bratton, Executive Chairman at Teneo Risk. This conversation will be moderated by Kevin Kajiwara, who is the co-president of Teneo Intelligence. Let's give them a really warm round of applause. Gentlemen, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Thank you very much for having us. We're pleased to be here. I'm Kevin Kajiwara, and I'm the president of Teneo Intelligence, the political risk advisory analysis and consulting firm in New York City. And the topic of our discussion here today is to look at security and risk mitigation in the context of cyber warfare and cyber crime. Which is scary stuff in and of itself, but I think after you hear what these three guys have got to say, you'll understand why they put us at the end of the day, because we're all going to probably want to hit the bar very shortly thereafter. Let me very quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get right into it if we may. At the far end over here is Greg Touhill. He is the president of Cyxtera Federal Group. He is a retired brigadier general from the U.S. Air Force and a combat veteran. He is a recipient of the Bronze Star. And he also led the creation of the Air Force's Cyberspace Operations Training Program. And very importantly, he was appointed by President Obama as the country's very, very first federal Chief Information Security Officer all the way back in 2016, because the government likes to get to be at the forefront of these types of ideas. Tadeo is next to him. He is the Chief Information Security Officer for Cyxtera, a former Marine Corps tank officer, also received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. And in New York, he was the special agent in charge of the FBI's Special Operations Cyber Division, directing over 400 professionals in cyber investigations and surveillance. So for those of us who live in New York, he knew what we did. And next to me is my colleague and one of my mentors, Bill Bratton. He is the executive chairman of Teneo Risk, a sister division of my company. And he and his team advise our clients on cyber risk management, on counterterrorism, crisis anticipation, critical infrastructure risk, and health crises, and a bunch of other bad stuff. In addition to that, he's a commentator on NBC, and he is the vice chairman of the Secretary of Homeland Security's Advisory Council. He was also the commissioner of the Boston Police, the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, and of course, two-time commissioner of the New York Police Department. And anything else? Or is that pretty much it? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I think, cyberspace is the battlefield of the 21st century. And I don't mean that purely in an industrial competition sort of way. I'm talking about state-on-state warfare. And if that's the case, then by definition, the battlefield is in the private sector. And in many cases, companies and individuals are going to be either targets or they are going to be the unwitting collateral damage of cyber attacks. And there is no Geneva Convention governing the code of conduct in this kind of warfare. And a lot of companies have designed their mitigation strategies around traditional cyber crime: theft of IP, theft of customer data, protection against being held ransom. But increasingly, they have to come to terms, I think, with a different kind of risk: the risk of outright destruction or the risk of hijacking and weaponization effectively. So destruction, it's easy to think about what type of targets there are out there, right? Critical infrastructure companies, defense contractors, certainly the financial sector, but there are non-obvious targets as well. It's not necessarily obvious that Sony Pictures Entertainment would have been targeted by North Korea. And hijacking and weaponization, of course, we saw on stark display in Washington a couple of weeks ago with the questioning of Mark Zuckerberg following the Russian interference in the 2016 election and possibly in other elections as well. So let me start with you, actually, Leo. I just want to ask if, if the scenario I posited is correct, what do you see as a chief information security officer yourself, but as you look at the corporate space out there, is there an acknowledgement that there is this other kind of risk, and how are companies bridging the traditional risks that they've had in cyberspace with this type of state-on-state kind of risk?
I think there has been a change. We saw some real corporate impact in the Target breach where the CEO eventually lost his job because of a perceived failure to address cybersecurity. And we just saw it recently with Equifax, where Rich Smith also lost his job because of the breach at Equifax, not to mention the real financial impact that a significant cyber breach can have. So I think 10 years ago, cyber risk was viewed as something new and unknown and perhaps manageable. Today, a significant cyber breach can lead to an existential threat to a company. If you look at Equifax, their earnings or their quarterly earnings still haven't recovered, and their stock value still hasn't reached the pre-breach levels. And so from an investor point of view, from a corporate leadership point of view, cyber risk has now overtaken every other operational risk and even most financial risk. So when you look at the risk spectrum, what can get you an immediate regulatory nightmare, what can get you what can separate you from your customers and your partners, is a cyber breach that is improperly handled, and that leads to a loss of trust and reputation. So there's no doubt that cyber has reached the point of being a top-level risk in the boardroom sense, in the executive leadership sense, and on the ground with the practitioners.
And how have you changed, your behavior, and by your, I mean the Chief Information Security Officer in general, as the risk has kind of evolved from, sort of simple crime to perhaps a more complex set of risks behind it?
Right, so the challenge for a CISO has always been to balance security with business operational needs and not to interfere with business activity. You need to run a business, first and foremost, that's your responsibility. The responsibility of protecting that business has been elevated in most companies. So whereas IT security used to be a minor subcomponent of the IT operational function within a company, we've seen the CISO role and cybersecurity become increasingly elevated until it's become a C-level position in most companies, and in some companies it's even a direct report to the CEO. My CEO takes cybersecurity very seriously. I'm a direct report to the CEO, which enables me to communicate not only risk but needs for our company. We're a security company. We're focused on security. We can't get it wrong. And we have a model that I think is designed to meet the threat. I would like to see, and I think it's happening generally across corporate America, a better balancing between the business operational risks that are traditionally addressed at the boardroom level with cybersecurity risk. I think it's happening. It's happening for a couple of reasons. One is you can just read the newspaper every day, but what the reality is that both federal and state regulators are imposing new requirements on all sectors, not just the financial sector or other highly regulated sectors. We're seeing regulators step up and require, for example, the New York State Department of Financial Services now requires every company that's a covered entity under the supervision of the Department of Financial Services, everyone is required to have a CISO, which is something that's not regularly mandated. I mean, you don't have very many mandated positions within a company. Having a CISO position mandated within a company is a change, and I think it's a change for the better.
We were talking about this a bit backstage before you got here about the fact that going forward, the CISO is actually going to be vying for CEO positions against the traditional aspirants of, say, the CFO and COO, considering the importance of that role and the risk to the information that you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a totally different set of skills that each position brings to the table, and a CEO is prepared in a way throughout a career that is remarkably and notably and fundamentally different than a CISO. And while you could have a business leader with CISO technical skills, that makes a good CISO. I don't think you would, as an investor, would entrust the future of a major enterprise to someone who has come up through that ranks. We're not there yet. I don't see that happening.
You know, you alluded to the regulatory environment in general. I wonder if I could move on to you and ask you, a big question for a lot of companies out there is, what is the appropriate proximity and relationship that they should have with the U.S. government, in terms of both with the elected officials as well as with the security agencies of the country. Obviously, on the one hand, it seems like prudent policy. On the other hand, it can have profound impact on your kind of marketing and your position and your reputation, especially if you're a global business. Google says, "Do no evil." That's one cell in the United States. It's another elsewhere if you're seen as cozying up to, say, the National Security Agency. And on the other hand, we saw on stark display a couple of weeks ago when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying in front of Congress that a lot of the elected officials are kind of behind the curve in terms of understanding the industry, understanding even the basic business models of some of these companies. So what's the appropriate relationship?
Well, first of all, I think that if you take a look at the current construct that we have under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, we've got 16 critical infrastructures, and I would venture to say that virtually every single one of those critical infrastructures is represented by somebody here in the audience today. As you take a look at the critical infrastructure out there that fuels our national prosperity and our national security that's built upon that prosperity, we're all part of the same cyber neighborhood. And I used to serve as Deputy Assistant Secretary at Homeland Security. And I'll tell you, I think that if you do see something, you should say something. It's just responsible citizenry for your neighbors. If you've got a problem in the neighborhood, you should share that with them. And further, as you take a look at major cyber incidents, law enforcement's going to be the first responders largely. I would recommend that the first time that you exchange business cards is not during a crisis itself. You should have that relationship where you're sharing information so that folks can better protect themselves and better manage their risk. And the constructs are in place for the protection of privacy for the companies as well. For example, under the Protected Critical Infrastructure Information Program that the Congress put into the Homeland Security Act, if you've come to the Department of Homeland Security under that program and you identify a vulnerability or material weakness, that information, you're not going to be punished for sharing that information, and the source is protected. So there's actually some fire breaks in there to help facilitate information sharing with the government that I'm seeing more and more folks starting to take advantage of.
So do you think that point, though, and maybe you've answered it here at the end, but these best practices of establishing these relationships and these channels of communication, preparation before crisis hits, essentially, sort of knowing that if you haven't been hacked, you're going to get hacked, whether if it's for criminal purposes or something at a more state level. Is that happening as much as it should?
No, it's not happening as often as it should, and those conversations should increase in frequency. Because frankly, when nation-state actors and criminal groups are going after targets, they're typically not doing a one-off, they're doing a wide sweep. They're acting as part of a campaign to achieve certain goals. They're not necessarily going after Leo. They're going for everybody up here. So if we're not sharing amongst ourselves what we're seeing, we're literally making ourselves as a community weaker.
And when you look at the concept internationally, of course, I mean, one of the hallmarks of corporate America is that they tend to stand alone for competitive reasons and at arm's length from the government as well. Whereas increasingly, our competitors, particularly in countries like China and Russia, but even in countries like France, companies are much more closely aligned to the intelligence agencies of their countries, and indeed they are elements of the industrial policy of the country itself.
Well, you know, frankly, I've seen, and when I was at DHS, I was put in charge of public-private sector partnerships. And one of the things that I've seen is over the last 5 years, a great improvement in sharing within sectors, and the advance of a lot of different information sharing models, such as the Cloud Security Alliance, the Cyber Threat Alliance. We in Cyxtera are members of the IT Sector Coordinating Council, where within the industries themselves, we're sharing amongst ourselves so that we can harden ourselves against the different actor groups that are out there and threatening our prosperity and our security. Often those conversations are not necessarily happening with the government per se, but within the community, because, you know, frankly, we're competitors for business, but we're also very patriotic, and we want to make sure that we are doing what's right for our customers. And by sharing information about threats, the entire industry can work together better.
I want to take advantage of your military background for one moment and go back to what I said at the very outset of cyberspace being the battlefield of the 21st century. Can a cyber attack constitute, in your view and in the federal government's view, an act of war? We've seen the latest national security strategy that has been issued that referred to a potential cyber attack as something that could warrant a nuclear response. What are the thresholds, and how is that measured, and are all elements of government in agreement on this?
Well, that's a pretty thorny question. Thanks for the fastball there, Kevin. Two things. You asked about my view and that of the federal government. First of all, my view, the answer is yes. I do think that there's activities there that are deliberate activities intended to attack our critical infrastructure and our way of life. And I would submit that, you know, even the Sony attack was, in some part, an attack on our Constitution and our free speech. Those are basic tenets of the United States. I think from a broader public policy perspective, and that of the federal government, that's actually a thorny issue that has not yet been resolved. You know, and as a military professional during my 30+ years of military service, you know, it was not gone unnoticed that the last declaration of war we had in this country was on December 8th, 1941. So perhaps as you know, we have conversations with our public officials, maybe we want to tee that up towards the top of the agenda as to really having a sober conversation as to, from a public policy standpoint, what are those thresholds for war when it comes to the cyber arena?
Commissioner, you've been at the forefront of relations between law enforcement and corporate America, and you have an interesting perspective because of your two different stints as a commissioner in New York, and obviously the world was in a very different place technologically. And so you have an interesting perspective on that. But New York is also interesting because of what it represents, in a sense. The largest city in America. It is the media center of the country. It's got the most active airspace. It's at the epicenter of the most active airspace in the world. And extremely importantly, of course, it is the center of the global financial system, both in terms of commercial sense, but also the Federal Reserve conducts its open market operations there as well. Talk about the evolution of how you and law enforcement had worked hand in glove with corporate America in New York, particularly the critical infrastructure.
My experience has been law enforcement, private sector, in and out of law enforcement, the private sector and back again. And so I think I have a perspective on both worlds and how they really do need to collaborate with each other. In 1994, as commissioner the first time, working with Mayor Giuliani, I created the first computer crime unit in that department, one of the first in the country. And that unit was specifically formed to start dealing with this new emerging crime that we're experiencing, identity theft, which was the precursor of so much of what's going on now in the 21st century as the whole digital cyber world has exploded. In 2014, upon returning from my second term as police commissioner in New York, coming out of the private sector once again, within a year I had to create a 250-person detective unit, a cyber crime unit.
How many people did you have in the unit the first time around?
10 in 1994 to deal with computer crime, and then the term had morphed into cyber by 2014, so 250. And simultaneously with that, we staffed up part of the FBI cyber task force that was described, as well as supporting the district attorney for Manhattan that basically does all of the investigative prosecution work for that financial community. So just an example of how the country's largest police department, had to keep up with the constantly changing trends and the morphing, if you will. The complications that the detectives in 2014 were dealing with were much more significant than you might expect than they were in 1994. And we're constantly in law enforcement in this world playing catch-up. As much as we'd like to get around the corner, we seem to be always in a catch-up game because it's constantly changing every day in terms of my world, my former world, was focused on the crime aspect of the cyber threat. In that regard, if I can just throw out a quick acronym that to kind of frame this issue. Richard Clarke, the former National Terrorism Security Advisor to then President Clinton, in a speech several years ago, talked about this issue and described it in simple terms, the idea of the acronym CHEW, C-H-E-W, when thinking of cybercrime, hacking, as it was becoming known at that time. You have the C for crime, my world. Crime, theft of your cell phone, crime, theft of your identity, all the various types of crime that the criminals are capitalizing on as every person in the world is networked through their devices. The second element of it, H for hacking in all of its manifestations, either the thrill seeker, the ransomware, the criminal effort, the military effort, the nation state effort. Third area is espionage, and the fourth area would be warfare. Sum and substance, those are the four elements, but over the last several years, you had to add a new one, IT. Chew it. And what is the IT? Internal threat. The employee who, against all the advice and counsel about how to protect the company's interests, basically opens up an email from somebody they don't know with an attachment, or the disgruntled employee who is basically now going to take out company secrets when he leaves or purposely muddy the water of the company's systems. So that the world of cyber threat is constantly expanding and changing. And it's a fascinating world, certainly, but one in which Moore's Law, the idea of the computer power doubling every 2 years, well, we're seeing in this world, I think it's quadrupling every several years rather than just doubling in size.
You know, you referenced Richard Clarke and terrorism, and I'm wondering, you know, General Touhill mentioned a little while ago this necessity of communication between corporate America and the and other elements of other companies as well as the government. But you know, for all those of us who live in New York, obviously we think of the world in pre-9/11 and post-9/11 terms. And one of the things, of course, that was one of the real tragedies on going into 9/11 was that a lot of the information was out there. It just wasn't being efficiently shared by the various agencies and then channeling up to the executive. Do you feel, and maybe this is a question actually for all three of you to weigh in on, but you know, is the communication and the sophistication, you know, being efficiently allocated between law enforcement, the intelligence agencies, the White House and other coordinating executives at the state level, and corporate America, particularly at the big sort of mission critical infrastructure type level?
If I could, let me frame it that where we need to be, that's not where we are in the larger sense. In New York City, I think we have a model that is probably a best practice at this time, that I consciously, during my 3 years as commissioner, really sought to ensure that there was very little daylight between the various police agencies that police that city, the various federal agencies that we have to interact with, FBI in particular, Joint Terrorism Task Force. For a period of time, historically, these agencies have been silos that really worked very hard not to collaborate or share with each other. With the events of 9/11 and everything that's unfolded over these last 16 years, we cannot have our various intelligence agencies, state, local, federal, international, not sharing, not collaborating. And I think we have a national and maybe international model in the New York City area where at this juncture, I defy you to find an agency that says they're not getting cooperation from the NYPD. Taking that into the private sector, NYPD under my predecessor, Commissioner Kelly, who set up so much of the counterterrorism intelligence operation after 9/11, one of the entities they created was the SHIELD program. Over 3,000 companies and their security directors in this entity that shares information instantly through emailing, texting. When something happens, there's the ability to send information out and gather information from them. So the prototype is there, but again, we're not where we need to be on this issue, my personal perspective.
Yeah, I think there's been, frankly, an overemphasis on the value of information sharing. Most of the breaches we read about are the result of vulnerabilities that have been disclosed for months, if not years. The problem is, how do we architect our infrastructure to be more resilient and harder to penetrate and easier to defend? Sharing indicators of compromise and technical indicators of compromise has become a cottage industry. There are plenty of intelligence vendors out there. As a CISO, it's hard for me to even manage all of these threat streams. I need people to actually do that. So there's no shortage of technical information, and yet we keep getting breached. My challenge as a CISO is, how do I make it so hard for the adversary? How is my architecture resilient? And that's where I think, that's what compelled me to be part of Cyxtera, is the notion of changing the way the adversary has to come after our architecture. It's software-defined perimeter, which changes the way the adversary has to approach us. They can't see us, and as a result, it's hard to attack us. I think that's the answer. I don't think more sharing is the answer. We have a number of sectors that do sharing really well, but still get penetrated. I just think there's been too much emphasis on that as the answer. It also transfers cost and complexity to those who are trying to defend infrastructure rather than the other way around. So that's my view on information sharing as a remedy for this problem.
You mentioned the software-defined perimeter. Just one second, I just want to follow up on one point. Software-defined perimeter, I heard Manny talking about that on Jim Cramer's show the other day. I wonder how much of this is, is making it so hard for your adversary versus, making your competitors the lower hanging fruit in a sense. It's easier to go after somebody else than it is for you, and that's a critical element of this.
Yeah, so we had a similar argument when we were advising banks to put bulletproof glass in front of their tellers, and the idea was, well, if they don't rob my bank, they'll rob someone else. But if you interrupt the cycle of a bank robber so that they have to study your bank, figure out it's too hard, and then try to study someone else's bank, you've already interrupted their efficiency and their cycle. And so bulletproof glass may not be the answer in and of itself, but it certainly transfers complexity and risk to the adversary. I think having a software-defined perimeter or changing the architecture transfers that complexity to the adversary and the cost and the risk, and that's really where we want to be as defenders.
Sorry, General.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of what Leo said, except for one thing. I do think that you need to continue the information sharing, but I do agree that in and of itself, that's not the solution set. And I do believe that software-defined perimeter is a game changer. And frankly, that's one of the reasons why I joined Cyxtera as well, coming out of the federal government, because complexity is the bane of security. When I was at DHS, I would send out the U.S. CERT team, the United States Cyber Emergency Readiness Team, to do incident responses. Over 95% of their incidents that they responded to could be traced back to either carelessness, negligence, or indifference within, frankly, a task-saturated workforce. In many organizations, you've got firewalls where they have over 100,000 rules that they've got to keep up per firewall and then throughout the whole enterprise. Cyber professionals are precious. We don't have enough of them right now, and we're adding complexity to an already full plate. And then further, the cyber professionals don't necessarily stay in the same job for a long time in a highly competitive market. We really need to make things less complex but more secure. And that's really where I saw the software-defined perimeter being a means of mitigating all of that and making things simpler. Information sharing, I think, is critically important, but best practices like new technologies, better architectures, having those conversations is going to strengthen national prosperity and security.
In this area, it's really like a doctor dealing with a patient, that there is no one best answer, that he's going to have to use many prescriptions and to deal with the many illnesses, that ones that will kill you, others, if left untreated, eventually will kill you. So what we're describing here is elements of trying to put together a totality of offensive as well as defensive capabilities. At Teneo, one of the positions we take is that no matter how great the firewall, over time, it eventually will be penetrated. Mm-hmm. That's the reality. They're going to dig under it, climb over it, that you keep trying to discourage them by yours being more significant than the competitor. But they're still going to get in. So operating under that premise, we work from the perspective of going on the offense, exactly what we did in policing. In policing in the 90s, and then certainly after 9/11 on the terrorism front, began to very much focus on going on the offense, not just waiting for the crime to happen, not just waiting for the terrorist attack to happen, but trying to prevent it. And one of the ways to prevent it in policing is what we now call precision policing, where we are able to, at a city of 8.5 million people in New York, for example, there's about 5,000 prolific criminals. The people that will kill you, the people that will rob you, the people that will break into your homes, out of 8.5 million people. And those are the ones that we focus most intensely on. We get their DNA, we get their fingerprints, we get their photos, we get now with the increasing facial recognition capability. Similarly, in this area of dealing with the cyber, whether he's a criminal, country, whatever way he is trying to get at you, the idea is to be able to identify him so that if he does come in, you can quickly identify who was in, what is his method of operation traditionally been, how do you isolate him, then how do you get him the hell out of there? But then once he's out, pursue him, chase him. Some instances you're not going to be able to in some of these Eastern European countries, but many of these people, considering the wide range of people that are going to try to penetrate you, some of them are nation states, some of them are in state nations that tolerate this activity, but many are operating in countries where you can actually legally pursue them. So there's an approach that we've been taking. Is it perfect? Not at all. But what I think we've all described here is the complexity of the problem. And there is no silver bullet. If anything, we need a full magazine of ammunition to go after this.
We've been talking a lot about prevention, but I do want to ask a couple of questions based on, what happens after the event. And I want to start at the biggest level because, we've talked a bit about New York being a unique target in many ways for everything from cyber to terrorist attacks and the like. On the other hand, New York has got extraordinary resources at its disposal, and also has been tested on several occasions. 9/11 being one of them, Hurricane Sandy being another one. But as you talk to your former counterparts around the country, and indeed in other major financial centers like London and Hong Kong and Singapore and Dubai and the like, Frankfurt. How resilient are these other cities and prepared for massive critical infrastructure being shut down by a terrorist or criminal event?
So I think New York is superbly prepared for that type of incident, unfortunately, because it's had a lot of practice. It's been the target of many purposeful attacks, and it's been subject to a number of natural disasters that have sharpened their skills. But I want to point out something that I observed firsthand when the commissioner was on duty as the commissioner of the NYPD, and that is the culture of the NYPD and their encouraging of all ideas to be brought to the forefront. So, for example, I sat in a crisis planning session with you, and a junior level bomb tech was able to stand up in front of the commissioner of the NYPD and say, this is what we should do. And every chief around that table nodded their head, understanding that that was the best practice and that's what should be done. And I think not only is New York prepared from a financial and technical point of view, but having been through so many rough patches, they've learned that process-wise and organizationally, they have perfected the art of protecting themselves.
Inclusiveness versus exclusivity.
Yes.
And I think, as I've participated in a lot of international engagements in my federal role, certainly a lot of folks in the different financial centers that you mentioned and our partners out there, they're looking to New York as a role model for not only protection of the financial centers and critical infrastructure, but we're seeing this across the country as well. And Los Angeles, for example, under Mayor Garcetti, has set up a similar model where they brought in numerous entities. They're doing cyber exercises like New York pioneered and the like to make sure that when that punch comes, you can take a punch and keep on going.
I want to ask a question for the three of you as well. You've all been in public service. Now you're all in private sector. But Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, when he was at Davos this year, when he was talking about technological innovation and disruption and all that, he made it really interesting. He had a great line, which was that things have never moved as fast as they're moving right now, and yet they're never going to move this slowly again. And it raises the question of the public sector, the security agencies, law enforcement, the federal government itself, are trying to hire people to stay ahead of the curve and to be able to work in concert with corporate America, and yet they're in competition for that A-list talent with the private sector. The remuneration differences are key. All kinds of opportunities in Silicon Valley and the like. How does the government hire and retain that kind of talent?
With great difficulty, I'll speak from my former world, with great difficulty on the one hand, but we're fortunate that many of those that come into the policing profession, I'll speak to that, come in for all the right reasons. They want to do good, they want to make a difference. I think same probably for the military. And we're fortunate that in an era where even at our senior levels of government, public servants are being disparaged, that despite that lack of appreciation for their dedication and capabilities, there are still men and women from all walks of life who are willing to step up and serve. And it is service. That's why we call it public service. They're not getting rich doing it, and that's part of the recruitment effort that we have difficulty with in this world, particularly the world of high tech and cyber and technology. But thankfully that there are many that are willing to make the sacrifices necessary.
From my perch, public service is giving back to your community. It's not about making money, it's about making a difference. And in the military as well as in the civilian government, we weren't necessarily looking to recruit people to continue their service throughout a full career, perhaps, but rather to do their contribution to society and then return to society in the private sector as better citizens. And that resonated extremely well with our soldiers, sailor, airmen, and Marines, and it also resonated extremely well with the public servants that we had and all of the departments and agencies that I served with. it's not for everybody, but everybody should serve in some way, in my view.
And is that message resonating well with the people that we're talking about for this type of roles?
I'll use the NYPD, for example, in their counterterrorism intelligence operations at one of the centers that they are housed in. You walk in the room and there's 50 very young people, my age now. A lot of people look very young to me, but these are young people. They're all buried into those computer screens in front of them, and they are, by and large, people who come to the NYPD out of some of the top schools in the country. We pay them very well to recruit them, and they want to come in for several years to do good, get an experience where they feel that there's a duality to what they're doing. And we're fortunate that we are able to recruit them because they come in with skills that police officers or a lot of our civilian workforce don't have, the skills that many of the people in this room are certainly familiar with. And thank God we have them, because they're the ones that are doing all that public scanning of open source information, putting that puzzle together, the jigsaw puzzle that dealing with all types of cybercrime requires high skills to do. Thank God we have them.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways to serve. Even if you're going to a local school and teaching kids, you know, ethical computer behavior, if you're going to a senior's home and helping the elderly and understanding technology, there's plenty of ways to serve. And we're seeing folks within our community of interest that are continuing to serve regardless of where they are.
So clearly, we've only really just scratched the surface on what's a very, very broad topic and one that should be of great concern to everybody, and I think it is. But I guess I want to leave it with one final question to the three of you, and something for to give people something to think about as they walk out. I mean, it's the eternal question. Given how much thought you've put into this, how much you live with it and work with it every day, on behalf of yourself and your companies, what's keeping you awake at night that we haven't talked about yet?
On my end, and I'll speak honestly, nothing. I sleep very well. And during my 3 years as police commissioner, 7 years as LA chief after 9/11, slept very well because of the men and women that were awake while I was sleeping, who were out there effectively protecting me, my family, our family. So that phrase that's used, what keeps you awake at night. Did I worry a lot? I certainly did. Any chief of police in America today. But the confidence I had in the men and women that we talked about earlier, that are proud to serve, that understand that their lives matter, that they lead lives of significance, I could have the confidence that I can go to bed at night and sleep very well.
So a big part of a CISO's job is to worry. So I do a lot of that. What I worry most about is, it's hard to explain, but I'm worried about a dedicated, well-resourced adversary who can understand our security better than I can. And that's a challenge for me every day. So I have to have robust communications with experts in my company. I'm very, very fortunate to have some of the best security experts within the company. So I'm a security executive within a company full of security experts, which is a particular challenge, but they're also a resource for me. So if I have a problem, I turn to some of my colleagues who are in the audience to keep me ahead of that curve. But the great fear is that there's someone out there who knows more about us than we do. I don't think that's happening, but if I didn't worry about it, I wouldn't be doing my job.
Right, precisely. Gentlemen?
There's a whole long list of things that could keep me up at night, starting with a daughter who lives in Seattle all by herself out there. You know, as you take a look at the panoply of different threats that are out there and the vulnerabilities as well, it's a long list. Ultimately, though, the thing that concerns me the most is fear itself. You know, folks not necessarily wanting to embrace the newest and bestest and taking some risks that are out there. People inherently want to go drive risk to zero, and you're never going to get there. You have to understand that at some point you are going to take a punch, but you got to be able to take a punch, get up, and keep on going. You need to build the capability to be resilient. And I think that those who haven't yet embraced that model are the ones that are probably going to be the most frightened, and that's what concerns me the most.
So with that, I think the message here is that you should sleep well at night, because people like this are working in our companies and in our government, but you shouldn't sleep well at night because we need to do a lot more of it. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending this afternoon. I hope you learned something from these three, and enjoy the rest of your evening and day 2 tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin.